Here's what the Hermit from tarot looked like originally. We've got an old man with a staff and an hourglass. And there's more than one existing cultural archetype that this taps into, but let's stick to the headline and his name, the Hermit. Well, this was a very well-recognized template. This is the holy man who basically forsakes the temporal for the eternal. He leaves society to ponder God, at least in the specific Christian version of this template, right? This is a worldwide thing, as we're going to see, but whatever you want to call it, the eternal, the universe, the important stuff. And one of the ways you do that is you get out of society and into nature. And there are countless historical and artistic versions of this echoing throughout history. And many of these would have been well known to the original users of the tarot and people using it in the early centuries. So just to pick one specific example, here's Antony the Great. You can see when he lived and died, and there he is out in the wilderness. He heard a sermon, it changed his life, he gave away all his possessions, and just went out to ponder God. And it is not going to be a luxurious lifestyle out there in the wilderness, right? The hermit is an ascetic. The physical deprivation, the lack of comfort, is part of being more spiritual. And as you can see here, the hermit does not have to be a man. This is Saint Mary of Egypt, born in the 4th century AD, or CE if you prefer. She's an interesting one. She was a prostitute who traveled to the Holy Land, not because she was on the straight and narrow, not yet. She traded sexual favors in the Holy Land to get there or get further once she got there. Yeah, she was wild. But eventually she did see the light at a certain church. An image of the Virgin Mary moved her, and she heard a voice saying, "If you cross the Jordan, you will find glorious rest." She crossed the Jordan, ended up at a monastery, and then from then, after being absolved of her sins, moved out to the wilderness, to the desert. So did John Big, who you see here, many centuries later. 1629 to 1696 were the years he was alive. This is in England. For some reason, his clothing was covered with patches of leather. He would beg silently for food. That's what a lot of hermits had to do if you're just going to live in a cave, which, by the way, John Big did, or live out in the desert, like Mary. You're probably not going to be farming enough, that kind of thing, farming and hunting enough to sustain yourself. So you live off of alms. Anyway, he would beg for leather scraps and then attach them to his clothing. So yeah, a lot of hermits were famous, obviously from kind of like the religious saint aspect, but somebody like him, no, just famous for, yeah, there's that crazy guy that lives out there by himself. We mentioned at the video's start, this was not just a Western phenomenon, this is global. So from the Far East to the Near East, the template repeats itself, and look from an archetypal perspective how similar this image is to some of the ones we've been looking at previously. And even deep into the 21st century, this kind of thing is still real, like with these examples here. And this book, this author and his book as well, The Life of a Hermit Monk. And we talked about being famous and the Far East for a moment. Those two come together here with this figure. This is a statue of Miyamoto Musashi, the most famous Japanese swordsman of all time. I believe this is at his grave. Well, anyway, he kind of put away his swords, retired, and lived in a cave, at least for a time, meditating. Speaking of famous, John the Baptist was a hermit. So you can see this is a pervasive thing, it really is. But there's another influence, a strong one, on the tarot character of the hermit, and that is the man portrayed on the right in this painting. He's pretty hard to identify, I think, for most people with an image like this, although the lantern is a huge clue. Here's something a little more obvious, him living famously as he did in his barrel, his way of secluding himself from the world. We are talking about Diogenes, the ancient Greek philosopher. Here's his legendary meeting with Alexander the Great, and Alexander was said to have remarked afterwards, "If I couldn't be Alexander, I'd be Diogenes." Here's a French antique from, the modern era, practically, and even then, say this was 1700s, 1800s, something like that, this was still a culturally obvious figure. And what is he holding? A staff and a lantern, just like 99.99% of tarot cards of the Hermit, including in the most widely used rendition in the world. Like I've always talked about, the most popular tarot deck today and in modernity is the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck. Not a fan of it, not at all, in terms of a lot of the symbolism and whatnot, but I love Pamela Coleman's art, and she probably did her best work right up front with her version of the Hermit. Now, Diogenes' lamp, as any fan of ancient history surely knows, was being used to search for an honest man. Here we see the Marseille, a version on the left juxtaposed with the Rider-Waite-Smith 20th century version, and very, very similar. This is a very consistent tarot visual archetype, even in modern decks and postmodern ones. And in my opinion anyway, it's all but impossible that many people in the early centuries of tarot's use didn't think of Diogenes when they saw that card. That doesn't mean they thought that was necessarily a depiction of him. I think it was probably more intuitive for them that it was a generic hermit figure, but especially because of the lantern, the more educated ones and tarot's original users were of the educated side of society would have thought of that. Remember that tarot originally was an aristocratic card game, and the cards were hard to make and hard to acquire. Mass production later changed all that. Here's another hermit, a saint, I forget which one, but getting tortured by demons. Just a pretty cool, arresting image. And we'll linger on this one, and in a bit here you'll see some other at once famous hermits, while I kind of talk about the start of this all. Now, we've talked about the lantern a lot, Diogenes, etc., this tarot archetype. It's almost always the old man, the old wise man, the old wise spiritual man with the staff and lantern. But if you think about the very start of the video, our earliest rendition of the card does not have him holding a lantern, right? If you remember, he's holding an hourglass. So what's going on there? At some point, and pretty early on, the lantern took over as the standard symbol, and that really changed the symbolism, right? An hourglass is an obvious indication of the passage of time. And a lantern has no such meaning attached to it, right? So things really significantly changed with what might have seemed like a minor change to the visual artists who introduced the new element. And an old man holding an hourglass had what I would assume was a very obvious implication for the viewers originally and in subsequent centuries, and that was about our mortality. In fact, here's the real kicker. This character's name was not originally the Hermit. It was basically just the Old Man. The first part of the major arcana, basically the first half, it does two things simultaneously. Let's just focus on one. One of them is tracing out the story of a human life from youth to old age. And after old age comes death, and maybe an afterlife. And that in turn was something that our hermits, like these here, and these images, were entirely concerned with, which was our mortality, our temporary stay here, and our eternal stay afterwards. In other words, the original version of the Hermit was really a reminder of death. Of course, properly understood, I have a separate video on this. All of tarot, the major arcana sequence in its entirety, is about death. The conception of the 22 major arcana cards being heavily influenced by the Dance of Death. And folks looking at the Hermit in tarot wouldn't have just recognized an instantly recognizable figure. Okay, a hermit, yeah, I know what that is. They also would have recognized him as one of the characters who is often depicted in the Dance of Death, as seen here, being led away, right? That artistic tradition stressing that we all die, it doesn't matter who you are, even if you spent your life contemplating holy things and being good, you're still going to get led away by the Reaper when the time comes. So the pervasive images that people would have been familiar with of the Dance of Death would have clicked for them in terms of the Hermit, and then the Hermit holding an hourglass, that really would have kind of doubled down, because the hourglass was a symbol, as seen here, often associated with death itself. And, like I said, the hourglass was a very common symbol associated with death. So here, instead of a scythe, he's got a different kind of weapon, right? An arrow in one hand and the hourglass in the other. Speaking about the arrow, you're talking to the only person to ever kind of focus on the fact that a arrow like this was once as common a symbol of death as the scythe. I've got a separate video on that. It's called A Forgotten Representation of Death, if you're interested. And there's plenty of images of a scythe being held in one hand and the hourglass in the other. Petrarch, Italian scholar, known as the father of humanism, a Renaissance figure, he had his epic poem or series of poems, The Triumphs. You had, like, visualized here, the triumph of death, the triumph of eternity, the triumph of chastity, etc. This, written about a century before tarot cards start popping up, this and the many visual representations created, inspired from it, were also a huge influence on tarot. The two most relevant ones for the Hermit card are the Triumph of Death and, more importantly, the Triumph of Time. That is not this one here, by the way. I'm just showing one of the random triumphs. So that's probably the major influence on the original card. You take the Hermit archetype with healthy doses of the Dance of Death and the Triumph of Time, and kind of a, Saturn, Kronos, God of Time motif. And then that changes palpably once the lantern comes into the picture, probably with some Diogenes inspiration. And now you have a little bit more of a search for truth, symbolism inserted and, replacing what was there before. But still, you have the definite, easily recognizable template of the hermit, the ascetic. And the person who designed this card definitely saw that linkage in particular. This importation of something from the East into tarot or relic from the West makes perfect sense. Speaking of modern interpretations, here's a nice minimalist take. Of course, this is a great thing about tarot, never-ending visual interpretations. Pretty faithful, but still unique version there. This one has a female hermit, which is cool, and goes a little bit more out of bounds, more outside the lines, so that's neat. And then, and this is cool and I didn't know, like this image here and the next couple, there are modern versions that seem to touch on that confluence I was talking about earlier, where, especially in its original guise, the Hermit card was partly about our mortality. Here's an old visualization of Petrarch's Triumph of Time, by the way, hadn't shown that yet. Now, the big switch, the lantern taking the place of the hourglass here, I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, because obviously there is the death card in the sequence itself. So even though the overall message is about our mortality and remembering about our ticking clock or passing sands, there's a little bit of redundancy in having that card, the Hermit card, be so on the nose with that aspect. I'm not saying it was an improvement at all. In fact, if it was up to me, we'd stick to the original iconography. But there is room within the 22 cards for some new elements to be introduced. And that was one that got put in pretty early on. Well, there it is. Tarot Historical Archetypes, the Hermit. Thanks.